No city collapsed overnight. No breakthrough was large enough to redraw the map immediately. But in eastern Ukraine, something else is unfolding. The tempo of the battlefield is slowing down. Each step forward is becoming heavier, and every movement now carries risk from the very first moment. From the ground, the war still looks familiar. Armored vehicles move. Infantry advances in short bursts. Artillery answers artillery. But in the air, the sky is no longer empty. When every movement is seen, advantage no longer belongs to the side that moves faster. It belongs to the side that prevents the other from keeping its rhythm. So what has turned one area into a bottleneck for the entire front? Why are mechanized columns being forced to slow down before they even reach the line? And what is happening around Pokrovsk, where the tempo of war appears to be locked from the air? Join military force to find out. Pokrovsk has become one of the most contested directions in the Donetsk region, not because of a sudden collapse, but because movement there is tightly controlled from the air. Russian forces have increased mechanized pressure in this sector, seeking an opening that could allow deeper advances. Instead of fast thrusts, these efforts rely on the gradual buildup of armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, and supporting fire positioned behind the front. The approach is deliberate, designed to test Ukrainian reactions and wear down defenses rather than force an immediate decision. This buildup rarely goes unnoticed. Ukrainian reconnaissance UAVs operate continuously over roads, fields, and tree lines leading toward Pokrovsk. When armored groupings begin to form, they are often detected early, sometimes while still far from direct contact. That early awareness shifts the fight away from surprise and toward timing, spacing, and coordination. Once identified, these movements trigger a measured response. Ukrainian units do not rush forward to meet advancing forces. Instead, they prepare the battlefield by shaping how and where the enemy can move. In this phase, Pokrovsk stops being just a map location and starts acting like a controlled space, where each approach is observed and assessed before contact even begins. Ukraine's response around Pokrovsk centers on precision rather than mass, using artillery and FPV drones to slow advances and break formation rhythm. Artillery fire is applied to disrupt spacing, force halts, and push armored vehicles off planned routes, while FPV drones focus on exposed elements, stalled vehicles, and coordination points. The purpose is not to destroy entire columns at once, but to remove momentum step by step. Each pause increases vulnerability, and each adjustment creates new signatures that remain visible from above. As this pattern repeats, the battlefield changes behavior. Armored units are forced to spread out, limit speed, and shorten movement phases. Infantry advances become more cautious, and coordination between vehicles and dismounted troops grows harder to maintain. Even well-prepared pushes begin to lose rhythm as time works against them. In this environment, UAVs do not need to strike constantly to remain effective. Their continuous presence shapes decisions before fire is ever used. Commanders must assume they are seen, which narrows options and slows execution. Control of the low sky becomes as important as control of terrain, because it determines when and how force can be applied. Pokrovsk therefore illustrates a broader shift in modern warfare. Success is no longer defined by how quickly ground is taken, but by who controls visibility and response speed over time. When momentum is removed without a clear breakthrough, pressure turns into a contest of endurance rather than movement. As this pressure forces Russian units to adapt and slow around Pokrovsk, fighting begins to extend toward nearby areas, where armored vehicles must operate under the same aerial scrutiny, but in roles shaped by survival rather than speed. Konstantinivka became the next focal point as pressure around Pokrovsk forced Russian units to operate across a wider frontage rather than push through a single axis. As fighting extended into this area, Russian forces brought armored support forward, including a T-90M tank observed working closely with infantry. The expansion was not marked by speed or mass, but by careful movement shaped by the same aerial conditions seen earlier. Ukrainian reconnaissance UAVs remained active over approach routes, which meant any sudden concentration risked immediate detection. In this setting, the objective was no longer to break through quickly, but to maintain presence while avoiding decisive losses. The terrain around Konstantinivka offered limited concealment, and movement across open ground created clear signatures from above. This forced Russian units to treat the area as a controlled space rather than a launch point for rapid advance. The shift signaled that the pressure seen at Pokrovsk was not contained to one location, but spreading outward with similar constraints. The T-90M's role around Konstantinivka reflected a broader change in how tanks are being used under constant UAV surveillance. Instead of leading a fast armored push, the tank functioned as a mobile fire point, advancing slowly and stopping frequently to support infantry. Its main gun was used to suppress Ukrainian positions and limit return fire while foot soldiers moved in short, controlled bounds. Speed was avoided because rapid movement increased visibility and risk. This approach placed protection above momentum. The tank absorbed fragments and near misses that would be lethal to infantry, while its presence reduced pressure on dismounted troops during exposed moments. However, each halt also created a predictable window where the vehicle could be observed, tracked, and potentially targeted. The result was a careful balance. The tank provided stability and fire support, but it could not force a decision on its own. Its value lay in buying time, not in breaking defenses. Constant aerial observation forced Russian commanders to adjust spacing and timing in ways that reduced offensive flexibility. Large groupings of vehicles and infantry became dangerous because UAVs could identify clusters and guide precision fire. To limit losses, units spread out, shortened movement phases, and avoided long stays in one position. This reduced immediate exposure, but it also weakened the ability to mass combat power at a single point. Tactical behavior changed accordingly. Tanks avoided long straight routes, limited engine runtime in open areas, and used terrain features to reduce visibility. Infantry stayed within protective arcs rather than dispersing freely, which improved survival but slowed progress. Decision cycles lengthened as commanders weighed every movement against the risk of detection. Over time, these adjustments shaped the fight. Momentum was not lost through a single strike, but through accumulated delays that made sustained advance increasingly difficult. The fighting around Konstantinivka shows how mechanized warfare adapts when low-altitude airspace is contested. Tanks still matter, but their purpose shifts toward endurance and support rather than shock and speed. Firepower is used to stabilize advances instead of rupturing defenses, and armor protects against fragments and limited drone threats rather than guaranteeing safety. Survival depends on discipline, coordination, and controlled exposure. This environment rewards units that can remain functional under pressure rather than those that move the fastest. Armored vehicles are judged by how long they can operate without being disabled, not by how far they advance in a day. That represents a clear departure from older armored doctrine and earlier phases of the war. Konstantinivka illustrates this transition clearly. Russian armor was not removed from the battlefield, but it was constrained by visibility and response speed. Every maneuver required caution, and every attempt to accelerate increased risk. The battlefield punished haste more than hesitation. This shift in how tanks are used raises a deeper question about the platforms themselves, and whether modern designs like the T-90M can truly adapt to a battlefield dominated by UAV surveillance and precision response. The T-90M stands as the most advanced tank Russia is currently fielding in active combat, yet its role reveals how modern armor now operates under new limits. Compared with upgraded T-72 variants, the T-90M reflects a clear effort to address survivability and awareness problems seen earlier in the war. Its redesigned turret and improved internal layout aim to reduce crew workload and improve reaction speed under pressure. These changes suggest that Russian planners expected tanks to remain exposed longer and needed crews to process information more efficiently while under observation. On paper, the T-90M represents a technical step forward. In practice, its battlefield value depends less on raw strength and more on how often it is detected and tracked. One of the T-90M's most important upgrades is the Kalina fire control system paired with new generation thermal sights. These systems allow crews to detect heat signatures at greater distances and engage targets faster, especially at night or in poor weather. Infantry positions, vehicle movement, and firing points become easier to identify before direct contact occurs. In earlier armored warfare, this advantage often decided who fired first and who survived the encounter. However, improved sensing does not mean invisibility. While the T-90M can see more clearly than older platforms, it cannot prevent drones from seeing it. Detection is no longer a one-way contest, and better optics mainly shorten reaction time rather than remove exposure. The T-90M also features relicked explosive reactive armor, designed to reduce the effectiveness of common anti-tank weapons. This system improves resistance against shaped charge warheads and fragments, increasing the chance that a tank survives an initial strike. In controlled engagements, this can mean the difference between a damaged vehicle and a total loss. Crews gain time to reposition, withdraw, or continue supporting infantry operations. Yet survival in a UAV-saturated environment is no longer absolute. Repeated observation increases risk over time, regardless of armor quality. Protection lowers the probability of destruction, but it cannot eliminate it. Each detected halt, route, or firing position adds pressure that armor alone cannot absorb. Taken together, these factors redefine what modern tanks can realistically achieve on today's battlefield. The T-90M is no longer a platform that imposes tempo through speed and shock. Instead, it functions as one element within a wider system, relying on infantry coordination, timing, and controlled exposure. Its value lies in endurance and support rather than decisive breakthrough. Tanks remain useful, but they no longer dominate the battlefield on their own terms. This reality also affects how losses are calculated and accepted. A modern tank like the T-90M is no longer judged only by whether it survives a single engagement, but by how long it remains usable under continuous pressure. Maintenance cycles shorten, crews operate under higher stress, and minor technical failures carry greater risk when recovery is difficult. In such conditions, effectiveness becomes cumulative rather than decisive, measured in hours and days of sustained function instead of dramatic battlefield moments. This pressure also reshapes crew training priorities, emphasizing endurance, coordination, and decision-making under continuous observation rather than aggressive maneuver. This shift does not signal the end of armored warfare. It marks a transition toward managed risk, where survival depends on integration rather than superiority. The T-90M fits this model better than older platforms, but it cannot escape the limits imposed by constant surveillance. Modern warfare now rewards sensing, coordination, and persistence more than individual platform strength. The T-90M illustrates how technology can narrow danger margins without restoring the freedom tanks once enjoyed. Events around Pokrovsk can only be understood within a broader strategic frame shaped by NATO expansion and long-standing Russian security concerns. From Moscow's point of view, NATO's eastward growth reduces strategic depth and increases exposure along Russia's borders. Geography plays a central role in this thinking because distance is seen as protection that allows time to respond to threats. As more countries joined NATO, that buffer narrowed and pressure moved closer to key Russian regions. In this narrative, NATO is not viewed as a neutral defensive alliance. It represents a system that brings shared standards, intelligence links, and long-term military alignment closer to Russian territory. The concern is less about any single deployment and more about permanent orientation. From Moscow, this shift signals a loss of influence in what Russia considers its immediate security environment. This interpretation has shaped Russian policy for years and continues to frame how the war is explained domestically. turning NATO expansion into a central justification rather than a background factor. Ukraine views the same strategic landscape from a sharply different position, shaped by vulnerability rather than buffer space. After the full-scale invasion in 2022, earlier security arrangements failed to prevent escalation, which forced Kyiv to reassess how national defense could be guaranteed. Diplomatic assurances without binding commitments proved insufficient, and reliance on neutrality no longer appeared credible under direct military pressure. For Ukraine, closer ties with NATO are seen as a practical response to repeated threat rather than an ideological move. Alignment offers access to shared planning, long-term coordination, and defense standards that raise the cost of future attacks. From Kyiv, NATO represents predictability and structure in an environment where unilateral guarantees collapsed. Public and political support for NATO cooperation rose sharply after 2022, reflecting the belief that security must be anchored in collective frameworks rather than individual promises. This shift hardened Ukraine's strategic direction even as the risks of confrontation became clearer. These opposing interpretations create a structural conflict that is difficult to resolve quickly. Russia sees NATO's presence as a growing threat that must be contained, while Ukraine views NATO alignment as essential for survival. Neither position is treated as optional, which narrows space for compromise and pushes the conflict toward long-term confrontation rather than short-term settlement. The battlefield around Pokrovsk reflects this link between politics and combat. Tactical decisions are shaped by strategic signaling aimed beyond the front line. Russia seeks to demonstrate that pressure can still be applied despite Western backing, while Ukraine aims to show that alignment with NATO standards improves resilience and limits Russian options. Each engagement carries meaning beyond terrain gained or lost. Over time, military outcomes influence diplomatic leverage, while political choices determine the scale and form of military assistance. The war evolves into a contest of endurance and alignment, where credibility and perception matter alongside battlefield control. In this setting, combat becomes inseparable from strategy, and every local fight feeds into a larger geopolitical narrative. This dynamic locks both sides into long planning cycles, where short-term gains matter less than sustaining support, cohesion, and political commitment over years, rather than months of fighting. From this strategic foundation, cooperation between Ukraine and NATO moves beyond symbolism, becoming a direct force shaping training, logistics, and combat effectiveness on the ground. Cooperation between Ukraine and NATO has shifted from short-term emergency support to a structured effort focused on long-term combat effectiveness. In the early stages of the war, assistance centered on rapid deliveries of weapons and ammunition to stabilize the front. Over time, both sides recognized that equipment alone could not offset sustained pressure from a larger opponent. This led to a broader approach that emphasized organization, integration, and endurance rather than quick battlefield gains. Today, cooperation is designed to build a force that can absorb pressure repeatedly without losing cohesion. This marks a transition from crisis response to force development, where the goal is not just to survive individual battles, but to remain effective over extended periods of fighting. Training under NATO standards has become the central element of this cooperation, shaping how Ukrainian forces use Western equipment in real combat conditions. Rather than focusing on individual systems, training emphasizes coordination between tanks, artillery, UAVs, and reconnaissance assets. Units are taught to operate these elements as part of a single chain, where detection, targeting, and engagement happen in sequence rather than isolation. This reduces delays and limits confusion during high-pressure situations. Standardized procedures also improve decision-making speed. Crews and commanders learn common communication methods and planning habits, which helps shorten reaction time in UAV-dominated environments. The result is not dramatic breakthroughs, but more reliable execution and fewer critical mistakes during complex engagements. Logistics and maintenance training play a critical role in turning combat skills into lasting battlefield strength. Western equipment requires consistent upkeep, spare parts management, and disciplined diagnostics to remain operational. NATO programs treat sustainment as a frontline concern rather than a rear area task. Units learn how to rotate damaged vehicles, repair systems efficiently, and avoid losses caused by mechanical failure instead of enemy action. These practices directly affect tempo. Forces that can keep equipment running maintain pressure and respond faster to renewed attacks. Over time, this reliability allows Ukraine to counter large mechanized assaults through organization and timing rather than sheer firepower. The advantage accumulates gradually, measured in stability and resilience rather than sudden victories. Equally important, training reshapes how units plan and recover between engagements. Commanders learn to manage fatigue, rotate crews, and preserve combat power instead of pushing systems to failure. This reduces burnout and prevents short-term success from creating long-term weakness. In a war defined by repeated contact rather than decisive battles, the ability to reset and re-enter combat becomes a decisive advantage that raw firepower alone cannot provide. This discipline also improves casualty handling and equipment recovery, allowing damaged units to return faster and preventing temporary losses from becoming permanent gaps in the line. The effects of this training and integration are most clearly seen at the unit level, where certain formations have adapted faster and more deeply than others, setting the stage for the next phase of analysis. The Azov Regiment illustrates how a unit can transform its role without losing its original strengths. Azov began as a light infantry formation known for close combat, urban fighting, and small unit flexibility. These skills were effective in early phases of the war, when speed, initiative, and local adaptation mattered more than heavy equipment. However, as the battlefield changed and constant aerial observation became the norm, light infantry alone faced growing limits. Movement became harder to conceal, and independent actions carried higher risk. Rather than replacing its identity, Azov expanded it. Battlefield experience provided the base, while modern training introduced new tools and methods. UAVs became part of routine planning instead of an added asset. Armored vehicles and tanks were integrated to provide protected fire support, and precision fires were coordinated with reconnaissance rather than used separately. This created a force that remained agile but gained depth and protection. The result was a unit that could operate under surveillance without relying on a single approach. Azov retained infantry initiative while adding structure, allowing it to function in environments where exposure and response speed now define success. This transformation reshaped how Azov makes decisions and coordinates action on the battlefield. Training emphasized decentralized command, where junior leaders are expected to act based on real-time information and shared procedures. Instead of waiting for detailed instructions, small elements respond to changing conditions using clear intent and common standards. This reduces delays and keeps operations moving, even when communication is disrupted. Coordination across roles also improved. UAV operators, infantry teams, and armored crews work from the same battlefield picture, which allows targets to be identified and engaged through a defined sequence. This lowers confusion and limits unnecessary exposure during fast-moving engagements. Over time, these habits turn planning into instinct rather than deliberate process. This integration also improves resilience under losses, because units can reassign roles quickly and continue operating even when key elements are temporarily degraded. Flexibility at the small unit level prevents local setbacks from cascading into wider breakdowns, which is critical in prolonged fighting. Azov's experience highlights a wider trend. Modern combat rewards units that can integrate information, protection, and firepower without becoming rigid. The goal is not dramatic breakthroughs, but consistent performance under pressure. What Azov demonstrates is not uniqueness, but direction. What has happened with Azov is not an isolated case, but a signal of a broader shift, where units across the front are reshaping how they fight to match the demands of a battlefield shaped by surveillance, precision, and endurance. The fighting around Pokrovsk is not just a local clash, but a snapshot of how modern war is fought. UAVs shape battlefield awareness, making visibility more important than mass. Precision fire controls tempo, turning hesitation into risk and forcing movement to be planned. Training and logistics determine endurance, because units that cannot sustain coordination lose effectiveness. What matters most is no longer the number of tanks or soldiers. Advantage belongs to the side that detects earlier, shares information faster, and keeps forces functional over time. Pokrovsk shows that modern conflict rewards preparation and integration over brute force. Subscribe to Military Force for clear, fact-based analysis of how modern wars are fought and why they evolve the way they do. This channel focuses on understanding conflict, not glorifying it, so viewers can better grasp the real costs of war. Because informed insight is one of the few tools that help societies recognize danger early and protect peace longer.